right. Good to see you, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome back to Department 81. Where's Robert Durst? Mr. President. He's here with Mr. Garrett, Mr. Chesnoff, Mr. Lewis, Mr. Ray. We have Mr. Lewin representing the people, along with Mr. Malian, Mr. Anderson, Mr. Milius, Mr. Miata. Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard the opening statement by the people. Now the defense has an opportunity to give an opening statement as well. Mr. Garrett, will you be presenting the opening statement for the defense?
Mr. Chesnoff and I will both be presenting an opening statement.
Will you do the initial portion?
I will.
Are you ready?
I've been ready for a long time.
You may begin.
Thank you.
Mr. Garrett.
And may it please the court?
Yes.
Oh boy, where do we start? After 3 days. I want to start by introducing some folks, and I want to do a little bit better job than I did last week when I wasn't expecting this. First, David Chesnoff, my longtime friend, is my co-counsel, as well as Chip Lewis. And Chip and I tried the case in Galveston together. Now, almost 20 years ago. Don Ray.
Good morning, everybody.
Thanks, Don. Tommy Mingledorf is a young fellow that's helping with us. He's carrying the wood and water. Lois Heaney is our jury selection lady, and she is invaluable. Chris Garcia is in the audience, and he and Lauren Childress. And Lauren, would you stand up, please? I made a mess of introducing her last week, and I apologize to her. Lauren will probably bring us twins before this case is over. And I want to introduce my wife, Janie. She's a little bashful, so she didn't want me to make her stand up. And my oldest daughter, Michelle. And she's given me 2 fine grandsons, 18 and 16. A little bit about myself. I was first licensed to practice law in 1965. You do the math. It's just about 55 years now. I practice in Houston. I live in Houston and Marfa, Texas. If any of you have ever heard about Marfa, Texas, Marfa's actually almost closer to LA than it is to Houston. And that's simply because Texas is as wide a state as California is long and high, maybe a little bit bigger. Now, some of the jurors during jury selection asked one of them very pointedly, "What are you doing here from Texas?" to Mr. Lewis. Well, Chip and I have been representing Don for, as I say, almost, not Don.
That was me that represented.
We're not bringing in that in. That's the only thing you're not bringing in. And we've been representing Bob since, well, I first met him in the jail in Pennsylvania in November of 2001, right after he'd been arrested. Rather spectacular. Shoplifting a chicken salad sandwich, a Wall Street Journal, and a Band-Aid. And I'll get to that in a minute. So what do you see here? That's the universal sign of pi. Lawyers kind of use it as shorthand to represent the plaintiff or the prosecution. And the reason I have this in front of you is to tell you that you haven't heard the whole story yet. You've heard the prosecution's side of the story, what they think the evidence will show. And that's a delta, and it's usually our shorthand for the defense. And I give this to you because it's my simple way of illustrating that there are two sides to every story. So that's what Mr. Chesnoff and I feel a little awkward calling him Mr. Chesnoff because I call him David or Ches or hey you usually. But that's what we're going to do. We're going to tell you what we think the evidence will show, and more importantly, what we think the evidence will not show. Because the lack of evidence is evidence also. So I want to start by saying to you what you've probably heard of me saying before. Bob Durst did not kill Susan Berman, and he doesn't know who did. What you're looking at, of course, is a picture you've seen before, and that's a picture of Bob and Susan in the middle and Kathie Durst. Years ago, when they were very close friends, the three of them, and Susan was a very close friend of Kathie. In fact, after her disappearance, Susan filed an affidavit in surrogate court setting out her love for Kathie, the mystery of her disappearance, and the fact of Bob and Kathie's early happy life that turned into a not so happy life together, but they were still together and still living together. We'll get to that. Chesnoff is gonna, I'm sorry, Mr. Chesnoff is gonna spend a lot more time on that. Bob Durst did not kill Susan Berman, and he doesn't know who did. He did find her body shortly after someone had shot her in the back of the head. He was coming to visit her for the Christmas holidays, which they had done before. What you're looking at now is a letter that was among Susie Berman's possessions after she died. It was an earlier letter that Bob wrote to Susie. They were very, very close friends. And it talks about how he was unhappy during Thanksgiving and Christmas with his family, who he was still talking to at that time. Remember, this is sometime in the late 90s. And so he said, but this is what I want to do this year for Christmas. I want to get us 2 rooms at La Costa. Or whatever spa you or resort you would like to go to for a couple of days before Christmas to a couple after, 4 days, maybe a week, and I'll meet you there. Understand, this is not a letter that was written right before Susan was murdered. This is several years before. We don't know exactly. It's not dated. But it set up a pattern, a habit, for them to spend the Christmas holidays together. Remember, both of them were Jewish. They didn't observe the Christmas holidays, but it was the Christmas holidays, and Bob was not happy with his family. Susie was alone. She had friends, but she and Bob were the closest of friends. Together they were planning in the fall of 2000 to spend a week or so in LA and in San Francisco. When Bob showed up and found her dead, he panicked. He wrote the anonymous letter so her body would be found, and he ran. He's run away all his life. We'll talk about that. David will, Mr. Chesnock will spend more time on that than I will. I'll just kind of outline what the evidence will show. And, as I said, more importantly, what the evidence will not show about Susan Berman's murder and investigation and lack of investigation. I want to talk to you about who Bob Durst is, what he's been through for much of his life, what he's been through since Kathie disappeared 38 years ago, and what happened in Galveston when a jury found him not guilty of murdering Morris Black. And I want to talk about Bob and the deviously misleading and heavily edited television series production, not a documentary. Not a documentary. The Jinx. I want to show you, and so will Mr. Chesnock, how that got us here today. But first, I want to talk about the elephant in the room. Bob's dismemberment of Morris Black's body. I know it concerns every one of us. We were able to spend a lot of time with you. My pal Chip did all the jury selection part. We have a lot of information about you, and I know that the dismemberment is one of the three things that bothered you the most. And those three things were the length of the trial, you may have seen some indication of why it's going to be so long from Mr. Lewin's opening statement. It was relentless, and this is not meant as personal, it was a little repetitious. The second thing was the idea that many of you expressed. I want to talk about what the evidence is going to show about it. The effect of the Jinx, the series, the evidence is going to show, as Mr. Lewin has conceded, as he must, that it was heavily edited. Mr. Lewin addressed you and said several times that Jinx was heavily edited. Bob's words were heavily edited. And what he tells you is we're going to see the unedited parts, the raw footage. I hope so. And I think the evidence will show you that the editing changed a lot of it. I call it gotcha journalism. But the third thing, and perhaps this is first and foremost, is the dismemberment of Morris Black. It's awful. I think that the evidence will show that the dismemberment of Morris Black is calculated to obscure everything else.
Your Honor, that's an objectionable statement.
That's argument, Mr. Guerin. Your disregard argument. Mr. Guerin will show you what he believes the evidence will be in the trial. You may.
Yes, and I believe that's what the evidence will show. That it overwhelms everything else. I want to illustrate what I mean. And we couldn't find a chalk, Your Honor. So we got a flip chart. I'm not an artist, as you can probably tell, but in my simple way, what I've drawn on the board is 3 buckets. This bucket represents what I think the evidence will be about the Susan Berman murder. This bucket represents what I think the evidence will be about Kathie Durst's disappearance. And I've drawn them empty. The Morris Black bucket is full. And it's full of bad stuff, bad evidence. And our concern is that the evidence about Morris Black will spill over into those other buckets. And that the evidence will show that those buckets, those other buckets, don't have evidence in them.
I'm standing objection. Straight argument, Your Honor.
Okay, you both can get objection.
We're just trying to take out the defense, Your Honor.
Don't do that. Okay.
All right, the objections sustained. You may describe the volume of evidence, I suppose, but you have to be careful because it does tend to become argument, Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir. You want me to take that down? I will if you want me to.
I haven't seen it, Aaron, but
I'll show it to you. It's not, I'm not real proud of my artistry.
all right. The drawing itself is not necessarily argument, so you may leave that.
Okay.
Kathie's with an IE.
Let me just move it over to the side. Let's just take it down, Tommy, please. Yeah, just take it down. I guess this applies to Mr. Lewin's opening statement too, but there's an old lawyer saying, if you don't get the other lawyer off his feet a couple of times, you're not doing your job. Bob spent hours and hours dismembering Morris Black's body. Let's talk about separating that evidence from the evidence, whatever it is, about Susan Berman's death, because that's what really is before you. That's the only thing you can decide. That's the only blank to fill in and the jury charge when you get it. Hopefully not at the beginning of summer, hopefully sooner than that, but the only thing that you can decide is Susan Berman's murder. So let's talk about separating that also from whatever evidence there is about Kathie Durst's disappearance. First, Bob fully accepted responsibility for dismembering Kathie Durst, for dismembering Morris Black's body. We have never run from that fact. Mr. Lewin says that he's going to prove that Bob Durst murdered Morris Black, even though the jury found him not guilty. Second thing about this, though, is that the jury in Galveston heard all the evidence, gruesome as it was. Third, the judge in the trial in Galveston instructed the jury that if they found that the shooting was as a result of an accidental discharge of the gun while Bob was defending himself from Morris Black's use of the gun, and it discharged during a struggle over that gun. And I'm going to talk to you about what the evidence will show about that. Then they should find Bob Durst not guilty. And the evidence will be that they found Bob Durst not guilty. A unanimous verdict after 3 months, almost 3 months of trial. In his opening, Mr. Lewin used what I think is the classic debate tactic of overstating your opponent's case.
Thus, straight argument, Your Honor.
Now, this is what I want to talk about. This is what he said.
Objection, argument.
Overruled. But
Here's the point.
You may comment on the opening and
That's all I need.
in distinguishing your own.
Yes, thank you. Oh. And it's not meant as personal. I've tried time and again to emphasize that it's not personal. But here's one example of what he said in his opening statement. He said with some ridicule, "Oh, the gun went off by itself." That's not what we're saying. That's not what the evidence will show.
You know, that's a misstatement. Mr. Durst, I put up a clip. Mr. Durst said the gun shot him. That was not my language.
All right, so you may describe what the evidence may show in your view, in distinction to Mr. Lewin's view of what the evidence may show. I don't think that's argument. You may proceed in that manner.
You know, we actually agree about some of the things about the evidence and what it'll show. Yes, it was a target pistol. Yes, it had a hair trigger. There are not many of you on the jury that have said that you know much about guns. There are a few of you that do, by training and experience. It was a 22 target pistol with a rather light trigger pull. So we agree about that. But what the evidence will show is that Bob's finger was not on the trigger. Morris Black's finger was on the trigger. There's some evidence that I'm going to discuss with you that will show that. And the other thing that the evidence will show, and this is directed at the opening statement by Mr. Lewin, and it's not personal, is that the jury in Galveston was able to separate the manner in which Morris Black died from what happened to his body after he was dead. The evidence will show that what happened to his body, the dismemberment, could not change the manner in which he died. No matter how gruesome what happened to his body after he was dead. So let's talk about the evidence about how Morris Black died. Most of this is uncontested evidence, and what the evidence will show. It's been written about, talked about, discussed and cussed for almost 20 years now, maybe even longer than that. But in the fall of 2000, in Westchester County, New York, where Bob and Kathie Durst had their cottage, there was an ambitious district attorney by the name of Janine Pirro. And she decided to reinvestigate Kathie Durst's disappearance. Kathie Durst's disappearance 18 years earlier. And even though there was no new evidence, the evidence will show, as I believe Mr. Lewin's already discussed, there was some bogus tip that turned out to be bogus. But it started Joe Becerra, an investigator, investigating it, and then Janine Pirro, we think the evidence will show, realizing the publicity value of it. She wanted to run for another office. She did, unsuccessfully. So they reopened this investigation, and the Durst organization, Bob Durst's family, by this time he was not actively involved at all in the family business. Bob Durst's family learned that Janine Pirro was going to reopen the investigation. They notified Bob, and Bob panicked. And he ran, as he's been doing all his life. They warned him that, and the evidence will show this, Janine Pirro could and would get a grand jury indictment and have him arrested. You know, there's that old saying, and this evidence will show it was used in this case, that a district attorney can indict a ham sandwich. So he ran, and he hid, as he'd done so often in the past. He hastily married his old girlfriend, Deborah Sheridan. You'll hear a little bit more about her a little bit later. And gave her power of attorney so she could handle his business. And he went to Galveston, an island that's literally at the end of the road. There's a map that shows what I'm saying. Houston's to the left, Pasadena's up there, and Pasadena will become important later because that's where Bob bought the little 22. In his name, by the way. Registered, filled out all the forms. And Galveston is at the tip end, the actual end of Interstate 45. It's right there where that red dot is. It's an island with a lot of history, and it's actually very pretty. But it's, some people would say, well, it's a backwater. It's the end of the road. It's somewhere where you could just get lost. And that's what Bob wanted to do. He wanted not to be Bob Durst, because what he feared was the same kind of lurid headlines and bad publicity that had happened 18 years earlier when Kathie Durst had disappeared. Bob doesn't make good decisions. It's part of his makeup. It's typical of his emotional condition, which has been diagnosed, and you'll hear some evidence about that, on the mild side of autism. It used to be called Asperger's condition or Asperger's syndrome. But in the latest issue of the Bible for psychiatrists and psychologists, it's, they now just call it being on the spectrum. It's characterized by social awkwardness, by flat affect, a lack of outward signs of emotion, an inability to discern the feelings of others, an inability to read social cues. Other people often describe someone with Asperger's or mild autism as a little weird. They have feelings and emotions, but they have a great difficulty expressing them. They're generally intelligent, and they can be functional. But they have trouble relating to others, and they're often seen as loners. Now that describes Bob to a T. Throughout his life, Bob has had difficulty in social situations. And as an adult, he frequently self-medicated. He smoked marijuana on a daily basis. And later, as the evidence develops, you'll see that he also drank. And he used methamphetamine. Marijuana, though, was his drug of choice. And every time he's been arrested, he's had marijuana with him. So throughout his life, Bob has run away from trouble rather than face it. And when confronted with the politically ambitious, publicity-seeking Janine Pirro, he ran away to Galveston. In order not to be found, Bob decided to rent a cheap apartment in Galveston. And he did. You've seen pictures of it. Because he's easily recognizable and has a distinctive New York accent and a male voice, he decided that he couldn't very well disguise himself as a woman unless he was a mute woman. But he thought of that disguise because he was so easily recognizable, and he bought a cheap wig and he rented an apartment from Klaus Dillon, who you'll hear here from by stipulation, who owned the apartment. He signed a lease, and he moved in. The apartment itself was small. There's a floor plan on the screen now, kind of a 3D floor plan. What you see toward the lower left-hand corner is the big room. I say big, it wasn't very big. It's probably not as big as the jury box. It was a combination living room, dining room, and bedroom. There's a closet off of it. And then there's an open doorway without doors into the small kitchen. There's a stove, there's a refrigerator, and off of the stove, off of the kitchen, is a bathroom. And that was it. Now remember, this is Bob was raised in wealth. He didn't have any choice about it, but he was raised in wealth. And here's a guy living in a $300 a month apartment that you can barely turn around in. I'm going into detail about this because, as I said before, what the evidence shows about the Morris Black death and dismemberment is so troubling to you. I know it is. So, not long after he moved in, he found that his neighbor was this cranky, irascible, unpleasant man named Morris Black. Now, it's not just us saying that Morris Black was an unpleasant guy. There's a bug shot taken of him when he was arrested in.
Okay.
Coming in.
We need to go.
That's coming in.
In chambers, Your Honor.
It's going to be evidence in this case.
No, Your Honor. Hasn't been. Your Honor.
It was in the. It was in the.
Your Honor, we have an objection. There's been numerous inadmissible things that he's already discussed, which I did not object to.
Okay.
It's now apparently going to just be open season without listening to any of the court's prior instructions, orders, motions, etc. We need to go discuss it.
Your Honor, I thought we had an understanding from the clerk that we weren't supposed to be speaking objections.
Just speaking objection. Thank you. Proceeding. Objection sustained. There is to disregard or reference to anything being arrested. It's not, you don't expect there will be evidence in the case.
It was evidence in Galveston, Your Honor.
We're not in Galveston.
Okay, please, Mr. Lewis.
No, we're not in Galveston.
So,
We're in Southern California, and it's very pleasant here. And I'm happy to be here.
you may continue your opening statement, Mr. Mayor.
I'm going to go into detail about Morris Black because the prosecution wants to retry that case. And I think it's important that we show you what the evidence showed the jury in Galveston. Because as that last speaking objection of Mr. Lewis said, this isn't Galveston. Of course not. But what he's trying to do and what the evidence will show
Your Honor, this is
is that he's criticizing.
Objection, argument.
Sustained. That's an argument. What Mr. Lewin is trying to do is not really the subject of your speech. The subject of your opening statement is to provide a roadmap to the jurors to describe the evidence you intend to present in this trial, so they have an expectation and an understanding of what this evidence is, what you believe the evidence will show in the case. So please don't comment about Mr. Lewin's intentions or anything of that nature. That is in the nature of argument. But you may describe what you believe the evidence will show.
And in answer to Mr. Lewin's opening statement, criticizing the verdict in Galveston, I believe the evidence will show to you why the jury reached the decision that they did, what the evidence was in the trial before 12 good and true citizens. who, once again, I'll say, found Bob Durst not guilty in spite of the dismemberment of Morris Black's body. Morris argued with Dorothy Siner. Dorothy Siner, by the way, was a girl that Bob had known in high school and had a crush on. Never went anywhere. It's just a name that he remembered from his past, and that's the name that he assumed when he signed the lease with Klaus Dillman. And right away, Morris Black yelled at this elderly woman, Bob in his disguise, telling her to turn off the lights in the hallway. They go on my bill. He didn't. That's what he did. So he was unpleasant from the start. Later, Bob actually dropped the disguise and began living as Bob Durst again. We'll talk about that. But Bob and Morris became friends. Understanding, Bob had a difficulty discerning Morris Black's social cues. They were pretty strong social cues too, because what Morris Black would do indicated that he was mean, cantankerous, and maybe even dangerous. That's important because of the reasonableness of Bob's fear when confronted by Morris Black with a gun. His Asperger's condition blinded him to Morris's meanness and nasty personality. Morris Black was mean, disagreeable, and dangerous. He argued with everybody. He started fights. Bob saw some of that.
Your Honor, this is again objection.
Overruled.
In fact, Bob had to step in once when they were walking on the seawall. He decided to walk down on the beach, took the shoes off. When he came back, Morris couldn't find his shoes, and he started accusing the guy of stealing his shoes. This guy was younger and bigger than Morris, and Bob had to step in and say, no, here are the shoes, Morris, they're over here. Bob wore that disguise, had worn the disguise for a few months, but he was not a very attractive woman. And he was in much better health back then. Right now, as you can see, he's great. The evidence will show that he's had quite a bit of medical problems. The evidence will show that he's a cancer survivor. He had esophageal cancer. Had 2 spinal surgeries. He's had brain surgery. He has difficulty walking, maintaining his balance. But back then he jogged regularly, and he tried jogging in the rig, and it was hot and it was itchy, so he'd go out to jog and left the wig behind, and one time Morris bumped into him as he was coming back from a run, and Bob was going into the apartment number 2, the one that you've seen on the screen, and Morris said, well, where's that woman that lives there? And Bob said, well, she's traveling, and I'm going to be using the apartment while she's gone. So after that, Bob dropped the disguise altogether. The landlord never saw Dorothy Siner again after signing the lease. And again, the landlord's testimony is going to come in through stipulation. He's ill and old and can't be here. Dorothy Siner paid her rent on time, though, usually by money order. so Bob and Morris became friendly. Bob often bought Jack Daniel's whiskey at a nearby liquor store, and Morris Black seemed to like that kind of whiskey. Morris did not smoke marijuana, but Bob did on a regular basis. They'd go on long walks on the seawall in Galveston, not far, just a few blocks from where the apartment was. Morris didn't have a car. He walked everywhere. Bob walked or jogged all over. And then Morris would invite himself in to Bob's house to watch television. Morris learned that Bob had a 9mm handgun. And once again, I know that it's a different culture. And handgun ownership, gun ownership altogether is very, very common in Texas. And Morris wanted to go shoot the 9mm, and so they did. They went out to a place called Pelican Island. It's a smaller island that's adjacent to Galveston Island, and it's unoccupied except for some industrial things by the docks. But the most of the island is just sand and very few trees and some sand dunes, and they'd go out there and shoot. A lot of people did. It's a safe place to shoot a gun, shoot targets. But Morris couldn't handle the 9mm. During his opening, Mr. Lewin played a clip of Bob telling Mr. Jarecki about how Morris was dangerous with the 9mm, and so what Bob did, by the way, a 9mm is the second most common cartridge, the second most common type of bullet in the world. It's universal after .22. And .22 is a small caliber cartridge that's used for target shooting, what they call plinking. So Bob went and bought the .22. He bought it in Pasadena, Texas. It's about halfway between Galveston and Houston, at a very large gun place called Carter's Country. And he bought it in his own name. He bought it as Bob Durst. Said Morris was, the evidence will show that Morris was fascinated with guns. But Bob grew to like the slow pace and the friendly people in Galveston. Morris Black knew Bob as Bob Durst. But there's no evidence that Morris Black knew much of anything else about Bob Durst. He did know that Bob seemed to have some money, and the evidence will show that Morris Black once took Bob Durst to see a place called the Jesse Tree. It's a charitable thing for homeless people. And Morris told the owner of the Jesse Tree that Bob might be able to help in their contribution. Bob began spending less time in Galveston, though, and traveling. He traveled a number of places in his own name, buying airline tickets in his own name. He traveled He traveled to New York in his own name, flew to San Francisco in his own name in December. He went to LA in his own name for Susan's memorial. He didn't attend. But while in LA, Sarah Kaufman, who Susan helped raise, gave Bob, saying that Susan wanted him to have it, a medallion that had belonged to her father, Davy Berman. Back in Galveston, Bob gave Morris Black a key to the apartment so Morris could come in and watch television while Bob was gone. Morris had no television, no radio, no appliances at all in his apartment. But he was eager to borrow whatever Bob had, and did so. There were several incidents that caused Bob to believe that Morris might be volatile, even dangerous. I've already told you about the time when they were walking on the seawall and Morris tried to pick a fight with a younger and bigger guy. Another time they were at a Mexican food
Your Honor,
restaurant.
objection, this has not been litigated, this is conduct evidence. Your Honor, I would like to be heard. The court is not, Your Honor.
Yes, I hear you.
The defense interrupted my opening statement. We litigated.
Be silent. You may object at any point where you feel there's an argument or inappropriate opening statement. I will rule on your objection. I'll hear you out later. Go ahead, Mr. Chairman.
And the evidence will show that there was another time we were at a Mexican restaurant. Morris became unruly and angry.
Look at me so bad. Yeah. You've accepted it.
Still there. But if it's still there, no photos on my computer. I just wanted to make sure nothing on my computer, right? I'm sure. Okay, I'm sure. Oh, okay. Yeah, it doesn't show. It just looks like a marble. But I can mostly at the podium. Oh, okay. All right. I'm trying. Yeah, I understand.
I'll know when he starts talking, but like I can hear myself
In the case of People versus Robert Durst, our jurors and alternates return to the courtroom. Mr. Durst is present with his lawyers. Mr. Lewin and his colleagues are present. All the lawyers are present. Ladies and gentlemen, we could talk about opening statements and wanted to iron out any objections because they don't interrupt the flow of the speech, and so that we all understand each other. So hopefully we did some good, and you'll have an uninterrupted opening presentation now from Mr. DeGuerin. Mr. DeGuerin, you may resume your opening statement.
Let me take a deep breath. That's the judge said to us over that. The next few things that I want to tell you about are what Bob knew about Morris Black. To go to why Bob was afraid of him. Why Bob had reason to be afraid of him.
Mr. DeGuerin, will you come up ex parte?
I'm getting there. Okay. These things that Bob knew, he told the jury in Galveston, and he's going to tell you. there's another reason to refer back to that little card I had that had the pie on the front and the video on the back. There's two sides to the story. Bob Durst is going to testify. We're not required to know that. But I want you to know that because I want you to know what he knew about Morris Black and what he believed about Morris Black. For instance, there was an incident at UTMB, that's University of Texas Medical Branch, largest medical school in Texas, oldest medical school in Texas, and they have a hospital there, a teaching hospital. Morris Black was sick and he sought treatment there. And he told Bob about an incident that happened there when he got in a fight with the people that were trying to help him and they had to tie him down. The Rosenberg Library is a beautiful library. It's a charitable library in Galveston. And Bob and Morris often went there because it had free computers and it's a loaning library. You can take books out. But there were children there and mothers and eventually Bob was there when one of the incidents happened. Eventually, they kicked Morris out because he was cursing at the kids and the mothers and the personnel there. That's what Bob knew, right? The neighbors complained about it. The other residents in the fourplex complained about him, so much so that Klaus Dillman wrote what we're calling an eviction letter, and we can put that on. Just number one. This was found, by the way, in the trash behind Bob's apartment after Bob had run away. It's part of the evidence in this case, and there's the eviction letter. That's very important, and it will become important pretty soon. Your contract of lease, I'm not going to renew it. It made Morris very angry. On the day that Morris showed that eviction letter to Bob, he was angry, he was cursing, and Bob will tell you, Bob went into the bathroom. I believe that Mr. Lewin covered this part on his opening. Bob went to the bathroom, and as he was in the bathroom, he heard a gunshot inside the house. Bam! Morris had tacked the eviction letter up on the door frame that goes between the living room and the kitchen. Here's the floor plan again. Right there on the door frame, Morris had packed up the eviction letter and he shot at it. He missed, but he hit the door frame. He only shot once. He never said he shot, there were two shots at the same time. He shot once. Much later, we went back, and the evidence will show that Max Courtney, who was a criminalist who was hired by the defense, went back and looked at that door frame. Number 11. That's a police photograph that they took while they were taking photographs of Bob's apartment. It has a little mark. You can see that mark. We've circled it. Now, so Max Courtney took off that door frame, and here's what he found. That's a far-away picture. That's a closer picture. And that's an even closer picture. Anybody knows anything about guns, anything about bullets, recognizes that as a bullet indentation inside the door frame on the wood. And it's the size of a .22. Now, Bob said to Morris, "You can't do that. You can't shoot in here. Look what you've done." And Morris sheepishly said, "I'll fix it." He later did. That's what that evidence shows. Now, this is a picture of Morris Black's closet. And you can zoom in. There's the caulking with which I think the evidence will show Morris Black repaired that gun hole, that bullet hole. Another time, and here's what maybe where Mr. Lewin got mixed up about it. Another time, Morris shot the gun in the house again. It was shortly after 9/11, the World Trade Center and Pentagon attacks. They infuriated Morris. He watched them on the television, and he was ranting and raving. Once again, Bob went into the bathroom, and he heard a gunshot. He rushes out, and there's Morris, and Morris has shot the gun in the house again. This time he shot it into the closet where a bunch of the old stuff, the television thing had come in the styrofoam, which eventually got thrown out. And this time, Bob took the gun from him and hid it. He said, "Don't ever come back here." But Morris apparently, the evidence will show, had another key to Bob's apartment, because later that month, Bob attended a wedding in Houston. He registered in the Four Seasons under his own name and attended a wedding. It was a nephew of his. And he was gone for several days. When he returned, toward the end of September, he registered in the San Luis Hotel under his own name. He stayed there several days. It's a very nice hotel. It's right on the beach. Bob has decided to leave his apartment by that time, that he didn't need it anymore. He drives to the synagogue in his car. He gets out and he jogs about, it's a little over a mile, from the synagogue to where his apartment was. And as he approaches the apartment, he hears the television. And he knows Morris must have another key. And he's in there without my permission. And I'm wondering whether he got the gun. So he goes in, and he finds Morris there. He goes directly to where he had the gun hidden in the oven in the kitchen. The gun's not there. He turns around. He confronts Morris aggressively. Morris jumps up from the table where he's sitting and grabs the gun and comes around at Bob and points the gun at Bob. Bob grabs his hand. Doesn't grab the gun, grabs on his hand, on Morris's right hand, and they fall to the floor. The gun goes off and it shoots Morris in the left side of his nostril. It's a strange play. Remember that. Here's the same computer animation. I'm gonna narrate it. All right. Bob comes to the door. This is the same one that Mr. Lewin played, and we can get it to play. You get it to play. I got naming rights on your twins.
Why I use chalkboards.
Do you want ours?
No, thank you. Appreciate it. While they're fixing that, I can cover something else. The autopsy report showed that although Morris Black probably died almost instantly, he had aspirated some blood in his lungs. The medical examiner had the opinion that in order to aspirate blood, especially when he died almost immediately, that there had to be some involvement of the nasal cavity, which corroborates what Bob said and what Bob will tell you about where the bullet struck Morris. Now, let's try that again.
Hey, John, stop doing
Well, maybe we can have.
Is it the same one that I showed?
It's the same one, but it has an ending that you didn't have on yours. Yeah.
Maybe come back after one.
Okay. We can go to the next couple of slides after that, like 17. No, that's not 17.
Pretty.
Okay. What's on the screen now is a computer animation. Bob will tell you this is how it happened. And it shows that when the bullet hit Morris Black, it hit on the left side of his nostril. And it shows the beginning of what's called blood spatter. There will be an expert that the prosecution will bring named Tom Bevel. He'll say that what he found on the wall was indicative of high velocity blood spatter. Now he's going to disagree with the way it might have gotten there with what we believe the evidence shows. But the next slide I believe will show the pattern on the wall. There. Now you can see it. It's hard to tell, but there was a drawing that was made of the blood spatter. And it shows that in his efforts to clean up Mr. Durst, Bob missed that. He didn't clean it up. It was still there after he moved out. We'll try to get that. I'm pretty sure we'll have a break for lunch before. Yeah, we'll try to get that computer animation fixed before we come back. So, what we believe the evidence will show is that the blood spatter on the wall is consistent with the way Bob says this happened, the way he first told me in November of 2001 in the jail in Pennsylvania. He'll tell us. He'll tell
Of
us.
course, I'll sustain the objection. Disregard what he told Mr. Gary.
Well, he'll. Okay. Now, Bob's finger on the trigger. The next things I want to show you include a slide that Mr. Lewin showed you. Let's leave that up for a second. This was taken by the police. There's another photograph that's a close-up of his hand, and there it is. Now, what the screen has showed now in very close-up is Bob's right thumb. The evidence will show that what you're looking at is a resolving blood blister. Bob was arrested on the 8th of October, roughly 10 days after the shooting, after Morris Black died. He was arrested in a strange way that I'll tell you about when we come back after lunch. But here's how I think the evidence will show that happened. It's on the right side, on the right thumb, Bob's right thumb. There's a picture of me demonstrating it. And I believe that we'll have the gun here. The prosecution will have the gun here. And it's a Ruger .22 caliber target pistol. Those of you who have any kind of gun expertise will recognize it, but you'll also recognize that unlike many semi-automatic handguns, most semi-automatic handguns have a slide that you break back and go forward. Almost all of them do. This doesn't have that. What this has is a little plunger that comes back to eject the fired shell and to put another shell in the chamber. That was very rapidly. But when it does, it creates a space where the ejected shell comes out. With Bob's hand on Morris's hand on the gun, when the slide came back, after the gun went off, it pinched Bob's thumb, right where you see, back to the blood blister, please. The police didn't know why they were taking these pictures. They took lots of pictures. But that picture, when you put it together with the evidence of what the evidence will show about the gun and how it functioned, it's proof that Bob's finger was not on the trigger. It's proof that he was struggling with Morris Black over the gun when the gun went off. It's proof that there was no intent to kill Morris Black. It's proof of self-defense. In our trial in Galveston, 12 jurors who heard all the evidence agreed that this wasn't a murder. It was not an intentional killing. It was an accident. That's what the evidence would show. That's what the evidence was. And I believe the evidence will show that whatever happened after Morris Black was dead could not change the manner in which he died.
Is this a logical time?
This is a logical time. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the jury will pick up at 1:30 with the conclusion of the defense opening statements. Do not converse among yourselves or with anyone else on any subject connected with this case. Do not form or express the opinion